Good afternoon, everyone. Thanks so much for joining us today. Barbara Taylor is a retired marine conservation biologist with NOAA Fisheries and coordinator of IUCN Red List assessments for cetaceans. Sarah Mesnick is a behavioral ecologist with NOAA Fisheries with an interest in incentive-based approaches to mitigating marine mammal bycatch. And with that, I will pass this off to Barbara.
So thanks to the organizers so much for including Vaquitas in this celebration of the 50th anniversary of one of my favorite laws, the Endangered Species Act. I'm going to be sharing this presentation today with Sarah Mesnick, but I'd also like to acknowledge my long-term colleague, Dr. Lorenzo Rojas Bracho, in this presentation. Currently, I am retired independent scientist, so I have no affiliation with any of the organizations that I'm going to be talking about today, but I certainly, it takes a full team to make vaquita conservation work. So let me start by saying that vaquitas are a species that is tailor-made, so to speak, for being an endangered species because it has a very tiny distribution and has been a naturally rare species. And it's in a really productive ocean where people also like to fish. So this is the only place that vaquitas live in the far northern Gulf of California. And it was just described scientifically in 1958. And in the early 1990s, I started working with Lorenzo to identify and consider the threats to this naturally rare species. We looked at pollutants and found that there was no threat there. We looked at inbreeding depression and found there was no threat there, and I'll elaborate on that later. We looked at the lack of Colorado River flow and found there was no threat there. There were about 60 vaquitas that were examined after they'd been caught in gillnets, and they were all found to be very robust animals. There were lots of calves, and of course there were many fewer vaquitas than would be their natural number. So there didn't seem to be any reason to be concerned about there being a lack of food for vaquitas. And I just want to point out in this, the remaining threat, bycatch, that vaquitas were seen entangled in these two very different types of nets. The net on the top, the large mesh, is a totoaba net, and then the net, the finer mesh net on the bottom is for finfish or shrimp. And that's what a gillnet is if you hear us talking a lot about gillnets. The two towns that are adjacent to vaquita distribution are El Golfo de Santa Clara in the far north by the Colorado River, and the San Felipe a little bit further south. And both of those towns were in large part founded to fish totoaba, this large croaker that you see in the lower left. And then in the central picture, you can see two gentlemen holding up a fairly small totoaba right next to a guy on the left that's holding the flukes of a vaquita. So it's very likely that most of the vaquita species was caught in gillnets even before they were identified scientifically. So there was a study that was done in the early 1990s to estimate the number of vaquitas that were killed as fisheries bycatch. And the estimate was 78 vaquitas annually. And they were caught in all types of gill nets, from the small mesh shrimp nets to the large mesh totoaba and shark nets. But we didn't know how to interpret that because we didn't know how many vaquitas there were. So the first full distributional abundance estimate was in 1997, and it estimated there were about 600 vaquitas. And once we knew that, together with what we knew about the natural history of porpoises, it was clear that the catch of 78 vaquitas was unsustainable. The second big survey was done in 2008. We got another abundance estimate, which was only about 250 vaquitas remaining. So roughly 400 vaquitas were lost in that decade, in large part as a result of shrimp fishing, and the shrimp was destined for US markets. The other thing that we did in that survey was develop acoustic monitoring so that we could tell the trends in abundance of vaquitas on an annual basis. So we set up a grid of passive acoustic detectors inside what you see there. That funny polygon is the Vaquita refuge. And the government of Mexico paid fishermen not to fish in the Vaquita refuge, and were very interested in whether that 50% that they were setting aside was sufficient to recover vaquita. So what you see in the colored dots there, what you want to see is a yellow dot. That's lots of vaquita acoustic detections. And you can see we had a lot in 2011. But by 2015, there are no yellow dots remaining. So there clearly was a drastic decline that was happening. And this was actually not expected. We expected to see the recovery, but instead we saw this decline. And it was in large part due to the resumption of the totoaba fishery. So the historical picture you see on the left is a gentleman holding a totoaba above a vaquita. And they were actually both listed on the Mexican Endangered Species Act in the 1980s together, because their fate is like quite literally entangled. And in around 2011, the totoaba population was recovering quite strongly, and a black market for totoaba swim bladder was resumed. So there was a totoaba market earlier, and then it resumed after about 2011, but the price was much higher than it had been in the past. And Sarah will talk about this in more detail. And then the video that you see on the right is actually taken with a fisherman's cell phone about 2 years ago of a vaquita in an illegal totoaba net. So by 2015, there had been a 92% decline. So the 8% decline between 1997 and 2008, largely as a result of fishing for shrimp and some other finfish, and then a much larger increase, about 34% per year, in the early stages of the totoaba fishery. And what made it particularly lethal was that these totoaba nets were set with no surface markers because, of course, it's an illegal fishery. And they used these huge anchors that you see there and left the nets soaking, they call it, on the bottom 24 hours a day throughout the breeding season for totoaba, which is roughly from mid-December until about mid-May, with a peak in March. And fortunately, there were two important NGOs that came along and worked with the Mexican Navy to remove these nets, the Sea Shepherd Conservation Society and the Museo de Ballena. And between them, they pulled over 1,000 nets. And I think unless they had been doing this active work, we wouldn't have vaquitas with us today. Nevertheless, the totoaba fishing continued, and we lost another 50%, getting down to now only 30 individuals in 2016. So the recovery team recommended that another group take on the task of taking as many vaquitas into human care and out of the dangerous waters where totoaba fishing was happening as possible. And that was called Vaquita CPR, for Conservation, Protection, and Recovery. In 2017, there were 90 participants from 9 countries with the goal of finding, catching, housing, and caring for vaquitas. The first vaquita was captured on the 18th of October, and she was about a 6-month-old calf, and veterinarians said sometimes the young animals actually acclimate better, but she did not, and she was shortly released in the vicinity of her mother, and her fate is unknown. The second vaquita was captured on November 4th, an adult female, not lactating, didn't have a calf, a perfect candidate for taking vaquitas into human care. And the initial assessment was very good for her, and they moved her into the sea pen, and she was swimming around well, and then all of a sudden sank to the bottom. They tried an emergency release, but she died of capture myopathy, which is basically stress and shock. And the veterinarians felt that they didn't know enough about preventing capture myopathy, that they could do any better with the next vaquita. And with only 30 individuals remaining, the entire option was canceled, and there was no further attempt to take vaquitas into captivity. There was yet another 50% decline between 2017 and 2018. And that was basically when the acoustic monitoring had to stop because so much of the equipment was being stolen. And the recovery team at that point, recognizing that the distribution of vaquita had contracted to a very small area, designated that area as the zero tolerance area and asked the government of Mexico to guard those last vaquitas, to concentrate their enforcement in that area. So this is a very busy slide, but I just want you to concentrate on the picture in the middle just to show you how much the distribution has contracted. So the red dotted area is more or less the historical distribution of vaquitas, and it's also a no gillnet zone. The black area is the current vaquita refuge, and the very tiny yellow area is the zero tolerance area, where almost all detections of vaquitas were made in the final years, and is where all of the research and enforcement has been concentrated. Mexico also enacted new regulations in 2020 and 2021, and I'm not going to have time to go through all of these regulations, except to tell you that sadly none of that is actually happening. We are not optimistic that a lot of it is going to happen in the near future, but worry not, I am going to give you some good news. So there are reasons to be optimistic about the recovery of vaquitas. During the last few years, we've gotten photo evidence that show that vaquitas can calve annually. Previously, we thought they could only calve every other year, and so this means that their potential recovery rate is double what we thought it could be. We also published several genetic studies that were of great interest. First, vaquitas split off from South American porpoises about 3 million years ago, And for the last 200,000 years, the genetics indicate that there have only been about 2,000 vaquitas in the northern Gulf of California, their only range. We looked at vaquitas from the 1990s all the way up through 2017 and found that there was no change in genetic diversity. And this low genetic diversity, which results from their natural rarity, also means that they could purge the deleterious genes that might result in inbreeding depression. And so they're actually less vulnerable to inbreeding depression than any of the other marine mammals that were examined. And finally, models that used all of this genetic data in an individual-based model showed that there was a high chance of recovery from only 10 individuals if bycatch is eliminated as a threat. So when we were out there searching for vaquitas, we saw some unfortunate things. In 2018, the compensation to fishers stopped. So previous to that, fishermen were paid not to fish using gillnets. And that resulted in us, when we were out in those earlier years, not seeing gillnets for being set for shrimp and finfish. But when the compensation stopped, and there was no alternate way for fishermen to put food on the table, they went back to gillnet fishing in force. And so not only was there still totoaba gillnet fishing, but now added on top of that since 2018 was gillnetting for everything else, the shrimp and the finfish. And so when we went out to look for vaquitas, you can see gillnets being set right beside the remaining vaquitas. This is a map of the fishing effort inside the ZTA and a little bit outside the ZTA on November 3rd, 2021, the last day of our survey. There were 117 of these small type fishing vessels, the pangas, inside the ZTA, 43 outside, enough gillnets set to run the length of the ZTA 5 times over. So a tremendous threat to the remaining vaquitas. But despite that, we were still seeing vaquitas, which is really miraculous. In the dark gray boxes you see here is the projection. If the projected 50% decline, more or less, was projected into the future, the likely outcome for 2021, the most likely expected number would be 0, that they should already be extinct. And yet in that year, we saw at least 7 or 8 individuals, and it was consistent that there were about 10 individuals that were remaining in that area. Last August, the Navy put out 193 of these concrete blocks that you see in the picture on the right with these metal hooks that were designed to entangle gillnets. This was a very rapid process, and many of us were very concerned that they would be effective at entangling the gillnets, which could then be effective at entangling more vaquitas. In other words, it would do more harm than good. But fortunately, that turned out not to be the case. So what you're seeing here is the red lines are the effort by the Sea Shepherd's side scan sonar to look for nets on those blocks. And you can see the inner area that's all solid red is the effort looking for nets inside the ZTA. And in all of that effort between January and May, they only found a single net entangled on the blocks, and they're continually monitoring that to look for nets. And the side scan sonar is very good at picking up these entangled gillnets. They're not a small object. And they got very good at it in all those years of looking for the nets when they were actively pulling nets with the Navy. So this is actually the best news for vaquita conservation in my entire career, is to see that they're not finding nets. And in addition to that, there's been a very large reduction in the number of gillnetters that are observed by the Sea Shepherd Conservation Society's science team. And also, when we were out there in May, we didn't see a single gillnet set inside the ZTA, which is just an amazing difference from 2021, and I think a real conservation win for vaquitas. When we went out in May, the visual effort was funded by the Sea Shepherd, and a team of very experienced observers were hired to work on both of these two vessels, the Seahorse and then a contracted vessel called the Sirena de la Noche. And we were assisted by the Mexican effort using the passive acoustic detectors. So what you see here, all the large dots are places where they had these passive acoustic detectors. They would regularly retrieve them and then let us know where they were detecting vaquitas. And the colored dots show the areas where they were detecting vaquitas, the colored big dots. And then the little yellow dots are places where we actually saw vaquitas. They're vaquita locations. They're not all individual vaquitas because we were able to track the vaquitas, some of them for over an hour and a half. So there's lots of little dots all in one area. And we do that to try to get photographs and so that we can tell the condition of the animals and we can tell whether or not they have calves with them. This was also the first time that we'd done a survey in May. All the previous efforts were in the fall, but as time has gone on, it's gotten windier and windier in the fall, and so we need absolutely calm conditions to see vaquitas, and so we moved the survey to May, which is also a very low fishing season. So our fall surveys were during the shrimp season, and this time in May, there's almost no fishing. There's a little bit of fishing for Sierra, but we saw very little fishing altogether. And that allowed us to look outside the ZTA, where we had been unable to survey in recent years because there were so many gillnets. So here you can see the tracks of the two vessels, and you can also see the places where we actually saw vaquitas, and I've colored the ones that had confirmed calves with them in bright green. And you can see that there are a lot of detections right up along the border and outside the ZTA, which allowed us to ask the government of Mexico to increase the protected area to cover these areas very critical for vaquitas and vaquita calves. And so the government of Mexico is now working to expand the ZTA in that area that I blocked out in red, and also a similar area that goes down the side of the ZTA that's closest to the town of San Felipe. And they have also said that they're going to add more concrete blocks. We don't know the specifics of the locations of where those blocks are going to go, but certainly that seems to be a very effective way to keep the effort, the gillnet effort, out of where the vaquitas are. We use a process called expert elicitation to estimate the minimum numbers that are in the area where we surveyed, and we estimated there were around 1 to 2 calves and we gave a 76% chance that there were between 8 and 13 vaquitas seen, and a 65% chance that there were at least 10. So this is actually very similar to the numbers in 2018. So the vaquitas are holding on, which is, as I say, a miraculous thing. And we can hope that these cautious adults continue to do well. But I think it's especially important for the calves, which only stay with their mothers for 6 months or so, to truly have a sanctuary where there is no gill netting for this species to have a good chance of recovery. And so I'll leave you with this video of a mother and calf. There's the mother in the middle that you'll see first, and then the calf that will be seen sort of at the top of your screen. We saw this same mother and calf pair on 3 separate days, and they were feeding happy, healthy. There were no gill nets around, and I think this provides some real hope that we can hold on to these last vaquitas while the things that are needed done to change the fisheries for the long-term recovery of the species to happen. And with that, I will turn things over to Sarah.
And okay, let me know. There we go. And there, how's that look, everyone?
Looks good.
Great. Okay, well, thank you to the organizers for enabling us to participate in this ESA anniversary series. And I want to have a big shout out to my co-authors on this part of the talk, Rebecca Lent from the International Whaling Commission, Vanda Felda-Brown, Brookings Institution, Lorenzo Rojas Bracho, Oceanwise, Enrique Sanjurjo Rivera from Pesca ABC, and Valeria Towns from Pro Natura. And as Barb just said, we, a few months ago, saw vaquitas. And they had calves and they were fat, and they give us hope. Vaquita is an unusual conservation issue in that we have a good idea of how many vaquita there are, where they live, and exactly what the problem is, and exactly how to fix it, which is to remove gill nets from their habitat. What we didn't realize was the magnitude of what we were up against. Vaquita is a growing number of cases now linking illegal wildlife trade, organized crime, and the loss of biodiversity. So this talk addresses this conservation challenge by exploring key dimensions of illegal or black markets and legal and ecologically sustainable or blue markets. And I'll highlight both challenges, but also opportunities and progress that give us hope. So as Barb mentioned, vaquita are nearing extinction due to bycatch and gill nets. And black markets are especially dangerous to wildlife because the rate of poaching can, and often does, vastly surpass the biological capacity of a given species and the speed with which human policies to counter it can be implemented. And this is certainly the case for vaquita. Vaquita are known to die in gill nets of all mesh sizes, but especially lethal are those for totoaba, this fish about the same size as the vaquita. And as Barb mentioned, in the early years, legal fisheries, such as those for shrimp, which was mostly exported to the US, and finfish, caused a loss of hundreds of vaquita at a rate of decline of about 8% per year. And it was the resurgence of this poaching for totoaba which accelerated the decline of the vaquita from this annual rate of about 8% to nearly 50% per year. And with a population decline of 99% in the past 10 years, this was one of the fastest declines ever recorded, and Vaquita is nearing extinction. Interestingly, this was happening and in that both totoaba and Vaquita are ESA listed. And in fact, totoaba was the first marine fish to be put on the ESA. It's been illegal to catch totoaba since 1975 when it was placed on the Mexican endangered species list. And in 1976, it was added to CITES Appendix 1, and in 1979 on the US endangered species list. Totoaba is prized both for its meat, but also for its swim bladder. And this is the organ that enables the fish at totoaba and many other species of fish to maintain their buoyancy in the water column. The swim bladders of totoaba are dried or caught, dissected out of the fish. They're dried and they're valued as a delicacy in China for their health benefits. They're high in collagen and also for financial speculation. The largest swim bladders of a female totoaba can reach up to $150,000 or more in markets in China. And their value is based on a number of factors, and I'll come back to that in a minute. But this presents a high demand for these fish. We've known for a long time, and as CERVA, the International Recovery Team, recognized early on that successful vaquita conservation depends on well-managed fisheries that support and are supported by the local communities. As Barb mentioned, vaquita are endemic to this very small area, but there is complete overlap between the habitat of vaquita and where these communities fish. And the area attracts a lot of fishermen. So this complete overlap creates problems, but it also creates opportunities. And those are the opportunities to use blue markets to incentivize the use of legal selective fishing gears that do not endanger vaquita. But we're challenged to scale even the small successful pilot studies. Why? There's many reasons, but let me highlight 4 of them. First, gillnets are well adapted, fishermen like gillnets, and they're the singular most common way of fishing in the region. They like gillnets because they know them, they're well adapted to the high tidal fluxes in the region, and they're efficient for existing markets. They're considered to be the most profitable way of fishing, and there's a lot of human and financial capital invested. While their use is banned and there's an embargo on the US and products caught with gillnets, there is a lack of enforcement, and most continue to are able to fish with gillnets out in the open, and the products continue to be imported, sometimes illegally, into the US. Fishermen also don't believe that alternative gears will work well. They expect them to catch less and to cost more to operate, and they have few incentives to use them. Second is the high prices for totoaba swim bladders that I mentioned earlier. This resurgence in the early 2010s of an illegal fishery for totoaba, motivated by those high prices. And in this image here, we see on the left a totoaba caught in a gillnet, pongas in the middle with totoaba and gillnets, and a seizure of illegal swim bladders caught a few years ago. The point is, though, that a single swim bladder can be worth on the beach between $250 or $8,000, and that price varies with time and the demand, the supply, but also with the size and sex of the fish. One fisherman at the peak of the fishery mentioned that he had earned more than $100,000 in a single day. And so it's just very hard to counter this kind of lucrative illegal fishery with the price of legal products. For example, shrimp costs between $5 and $20, is paid between $5 and $20 a kilo on the beach. So there's very little, there's high incentive to poach. The third reason is that formal and informal institutions are challenged to protect the region's natural resources due to the increasing presence of organized crime and a history of tolerated corruption and non-compliance with regulations. Mexican cartels, criminal groups are now involved in the totoaba trade, and they're becoming increasingly engaged in other fisheries, such as fish and shrimp. And the cartels and coercion constrain profit, access, and choice. Fishermen sometimes become indebted or paid in drugs, and they cannot get out. In addition, the current Mexican administration changed the national policies against crime and adopted a non-confrontational policy. And in addition, there's a high increasing nexus with illegal economies. This creates a much wider and more complex array of illicit and financial issues. And as Barb mentioned, concrete blocks with hooks are protecting these ETA, but this illegal fishing with gillnets continues in the areas surrounding it. And the fourth reason is the lack of support for the development of alternative fisheries. And most local fishers don't believe that new gears will work as well as gillnets, and there's been a lack of support from the fishing authorities for their adoption. So gillnets remain the gear of choice for the fishing community. There are a lot of obstacles to and challenges. These include a number of items here, but all of these need to be addressed in order for these legal alternatives to be adopted. And this includes not only gear and training and access, but areas to fish that are clear of gillnets, and the development of markets that want and will pay perhaps price premiums for products from these sustainable gears that don't endanger vaquita. And this is where I've been spending most of my time, is networking and trying to support the development of these gears and the development of markets. And also I want to point out others at NOAA Fisheries, particularly in the Southeast Fisheries Science Center, who are gear experts, have also been working on these challenges. But let me show you some of the good news. And this is that there's a number of motivated fishers. They're assisted by a group of nonprofits and philanthropic foundations and that have been making significant progress in the development and application of these new gears and their socialization in the communities. This is a story of real conservation heroes working on the ground, the men and women that are trialing these gears and working with the communities. One of the things that's important to note is it's very clear that there's not going to be a single silver bullet to replace a gillnet. But multiple gears are going to have to be developed for particular fisheries and their markets developed with those fishing products. So let me give you 3 examples of some of the new gears. Promising gears exist for shrimp. And shrimp was the most lucrative legal product in the Upper Gulf. And the Museo de Ballena and a number of other fishermen have been participating in trials for the suripera, which looks sort of like a big butterfly net. And they've been successful in catching shrimp and in receiving high value or high prices for this shrimp. Interestingly, the suripera net is either in other areas of Mexico, the boat moves under sail. Here in the Upper Gulf, it moves with the current. So there's a very low carbon footprint for these shrimp. And the capture rates show that this could be profitable. Another method of fishing is a small trawl. Pesca ABC has been testing this A larger trawl net was tried in early years, but it was suggested that a smaller trawl net might be a better one. And that was not able to be tested until recently because of lack of funding. But the good news is that initial tests are showing high capture rates similar to those of gillnets. And another type of gear for finfish is using just traditional hook and line or long lines. And these are going after finfish such as corvina, that's fully traceable. And the interesting thing is the group Pesca ABC is trialing efforts with ikejime, which is a traditional Japanese method of treating the fish after it's killed, so it has very high value. And indeed, they're selling this for over about 3 times higher the rate than fish that are caught with gillnets. So I also wanted to mention that not only are these efforts going on in the water primarily with fishermen, but there's a lot of women working in the region. And a number of these women were on our last survey. And they are moving together with the fishermen to develop monitoring methods, traceability methods, working with the culinary markets, and developing other means of earning livings too on the water, such as oyster farming. So these are the real heroes. But ultimately, it's how profitable can these be? And this is an example from a couple of years ago, looking at the economics of fishing. And this shows a lower level of product caught with a Suripara net, the price range, and it was able to garner higher prices, and the estimated earnings for a average set. And you can see that it's possible to earn money on this, but compared to the typical use of 2 to 3 illegal gillnets, the catch is lower, although the price is higher. So the illegal fishing with illegal gillnets is still seems to be more profitable. And it's very difficult to compare that with what someone gets from fishing totoaba because the price range is so much, but it's very hard to compete with that lucrative illegal market. And the point is the higher net income expected from illegal gillnets is difficult to counter without some intervention in both markets, both in the blue markets for sustainable products and in the black markets. So how might we alter the structure of incentives? So this diagram suggests some of those ways, which is to increase the value of products in blue markets is to support legal fishing by access, training, and practice with new gears, to develop traceability, and to seek out and grow markets for sustainable products that may garner price premiums or provide preferential access to products caught without harming Vaquita, and to celebrate the innovators that have paved the way. For black markets, what we need to do is address this as the financial illegality that it is urgently needed to keep the gillnets out of the zero tolerance area, as has been shown. Action against the cartels, interdiction of trafficking networks, demand reduction in distant markets, and of course, building up economic opportunities and community buy-in for alternative ways of making a living that are not illegal. So what we've taken away from this are 2 things that I think are helpful to share. And the first is that you need to act early. Developing these new selective fishing gears and livelihoods and the blue markets that need to go with them need to occur early. It takes a long time to develop these, and we have to act before organized crime and other illegal livelihoods take over. It's not hopeless, but it's much more difficult than when we were just dealing with, say, the shrimp fisheries that were using gillnets. So what was possible before 2010 is not possible now, but there is still hope. And we also need to take the long view. Developing these blue markets take time. It underscores the needs for a holistic approach and a wide variety of policy instruments, as well as blended investment models. But we have hope. As we've said, there's females with calves observed. There are fishermen using these alternative gears, and markets are developing. And fishing leaders are engaged in actions to counter the illegal fishing in their towns. I mentioned policy instruments, and I wanted to end with a couple comments and coming back to the ESA, and that there's a number of legislative tools and international agreements we have that can help motivate and support Mexico to save the vaquita. Barb and I are not experts on these, but Angie Soma and Nina are on the call with us and on the panel and can answer questions. And these include the CITES, which is the Convention of International Trade of Endangered Species, the USMCA, which is the Trilateral Trade Agreement with Mexico and Canada, and the US Marine Mammal Protection Act. And the ESA has done a number of things, including help keep this continued focus and conservation effort on vaquita and totoaba. It's provided focus and attention on vaquita prior to the years when CITES was really starting to address this issue in earnest. It's encouraged the US to work to advance CITES actions, given that both vaquita and totoaba are listed. And it's provided a backstop to CITES Appendix 1, the listing of totoaba, which ensures the US will not allow importation of aquaculture totoaba if this is approved by CITES. So I'd like to end, we've talked a lot about what is going on in Mexico, what these conservation heroes are doing, what our legislative and international agreement authorities are, but I want to end by what can we do? And I call this culinary conservation. It's a way of aligning your love of the ocean with your passion for food. While seafood from the upper Gulf of California are not legal to import into the US, we're working there to connect chefs and fishermen with sustainably sourced products that do not endanger vaquita. And we can show our support. And that's the role for the rest of us, to seek out, ask, and eat responsibly. We eat loudly to save the ocean and support the fishers that practice these methods. And if you want to learn more about sustainable seafood, check out the NOAA Fisheries website to learn more. And thank you very much. And we can open it up for questions. And I'd like to invite Nina and Angie to please turn on your cameras. And there we are. And happy to take questions. Please put your questions in the chat box.
Yeah, Sarah, I will start with one of the questions that's in the chat box, and it is, are there any social science efforts being done towards protecting vaquitas? And it came in before your talk, but I'll let you have a go at that one first.
Yes, and in Mexico, there's been a number of socioeconomic studies of the region, and also socioeconomic studies of the fisheries. And these are really important foundationally for two reasons. It shows the survey work done with the communities has shown what alternatives are desired by the communities and what are effective. And I'll point out one thing from one of these earlier studies by Sarah Avila. She's a Mexican economist, and she looked to see, there was an effort a number of years ago. We've talked a lot about fishing, but there's other economic alternatives people can do. So ecotourism, or opening other shops, or any kind of other business. And there was some support for those, and she went and looked to see which of those were successful. And interestingly, the ones that were most successful were when the money was given to the wives of fishermen, and the women had also gotten bank loans to help start the businesses. And we know good money management when we see it for families, and these businesses were actually the ones that were still in existence a few years later when she did her analyses. So I think that's very interesting. It shows the value of microloans. It shows that there's other things that we haven't talked about here, but other ways to build a diverse economic base for local communities. The other economic work has been done on the value of the fisheries and what kinds of price premiums, for instance, would need to be acquired to make up for perhaps lower quantity but higher quality coming out of alternative gears. And I'll stop there, but there's a number of amazing Mexican economists working in the area. And Enrique Sanjurjo, who I mentioned, Pesca ABC, is an economist, and he's now the executive director of Pesca ABC. So an economist working directly with these fishermen to be able to build the financial capacity to make new gears work.
So we don't have very much remaining time. We're getting some nice questions to come in, and I'm going to pitch one to Angie here. Can folks go into a little bit more detail on the mechanisms in the international authorities, and specifically, how can they be leveraged?
Well, I would say I'm not really able to speak to the USMCA. That is the U.S. Trade Representative's office that has the lead for that. And I know that those discussions are continuing and ongoing negotiations there related to this issue. In terms of CITES, CITES has more recently taken a very active role in trying to address for CITES, CITES regulates international trade. So it's really about the totoaba trade, which is illegal because, as was mentioned in the previous presentations, it's listed as CITES Appendix 1. And CITES has employed its trade sanction measures, which when parties are out of compliance with CITES, other CITES parties may be asked to cease trading with that party in CITES listed species. And that happened earlier this year, this spring, when Mexico failed to adequately implement decisions that were made at the last CITES Conference of the Parties in November. And CITES did request that its parties stop or cease trade in all CITES listed species with Mexico, which includes not just fisheries products, but a lot of terrestrial and plant species as well. And that was a significant embargo of CITES listed products, and it did motivate Mexico to take some of these decisions more seriously, and they did amend their plan, and they have taken some action to the point where those restrictions have now been lifted. We still have a long ways to go, but CITES has been somewhat effective in getting Mexico to take additional measures to address the illegal fishery. And then I may turn to Nina to see if she wants to add anything about the MMPA import restriction considerations that NIPS is undertaking.
Sure. So the Marine Mammal Protection Act, as Sarah noted, their import restrictions have been in place starting in 2017, augmented in 2020, and those have been in place and will remain in place until there is a decision that demonstrates that Mexico has a regulatory program that would be comparable in effectiveness to the U.S. regulatory program. So we have used that stick, so to speak, as a means to bring about greater compliance with the Marine Mammal Protection Act import restrictions and encourage Mexico to undertake vaquita conservation. But as Barb noted, their regulatory program has not been fully implemented. And so, we are still waiting on Mexico to provide the documentary evidence that they are comparable in effectiveness to the United States.
Okay, I think we only have time for one more question. And I think it's a good one for a broad general audience. How can we make the public more aware of culinary conservation needed? What steps for public outreach and education are underway?
Great. I think we sometimes underestimate our own power to make change. You think, well, I'm just one person. What can I do? But one person's change leads to collective action, often leads to policy changes. And what we see in the U.S. is well known, global leader in sustainable seafood. And so I think that the agency now has a sustainable seafood strategy. And I think we're going to be seeing more from NOAA Fisheries about how our actions at the table interact with our actions on the water, how we can participate in supporting sustainable seafood. And so one of the things is looking to NOAA Fisheries and the power our agency has to tell these stories. And I think that the stories that highlight people and what people are doing are very are motivating. And you'll see more and more of those stories coming out of the NOAA Fisheries Sustainable Seafood Initiatives. So I think I like to tell people to eat loud, eat local when you can, and ask questions about where your food is coming from. Get to know the people that produce your food. And I think that we need to do more on the storytelling around storied seafood. We have a project with Aquarium of the Pacific on vaquita conservation. You can look up that when we post the talks. You can see the link for that, and it tells the stories of the fishermen, and it tells the stories from the point of view of the chefs as well. And I think that's powerful because our chefs are really good promoters of stories about where they get their food from and why that's important. So I think as an agency supporting these efforts, and as the philanthropic and NGO community starts to see some of these products going into the market, I think we'll be able to produce more multimedia stories about our seafood.
And if I can just sort of add a little bit to that, I work with, listing all porpoises, dolphins, and whales around the world. And by far, the greatest threat is gillnets. I mean, by far. I mean, there's just nothing that even comes close to that. And even though a lot of things are outside of our power, the Marine Mammal Protection Act really does a pretty darn decent job at protecting marine mammals. And if you're concerned about being able to protect marine mammals, if that's a concern of yours, then eating seafood that's caught in the US is a pretty darn good way to do that until the international community is sort of brought into line. And right now it's not in line. I mean, steps are being taken in that direction, but it's something that is pretty simple for you to do on a menu. Is just say, you know, I know if I want to have a seafood dinner, I can ask, well, you can ask whether it's caught with a gillnet. Almost certainly they won't know. But they might know whether it's coming from an international fishery or a domestic fishery. And I would always choose the domestic fishery over the international fishery, because there just are not adequate regulations in international fisheries so far.